Hello students, today we're going to talk about Jean-Jacques Rousseau, a very interesting and central character in the history of political thought. Probably one of the most profound and original thinkers in history, and his influence is still felt today. He was a key figure in the Republican revolutions of the 18th century, particularly the French Revolution of 1789. Now, there was an enormous range to his intellect, and his work had a deep impression on the likes of Immanuel Kant, George William Frederick Hegel, and thus on Marx and indeed beyond. Now, Rousseau's a complex character. He was a complex individual. In his early days, he seems to have been a wandering, isolated, womanizing, irresponsible misfit, at least by the values and norms of his time. And in his early life, Rousseau struggled to find a purpose, it is fair to say. He tried his hand at many things and wasn't very good at seemingly at anything. He even attempted to compose an opera, which was never really accorded much artistic merit. And towards the end of his life, poor old Rousseau showed distinct signs of paranoia, a sort of a psychosis. And I think this is partly because, like many a radical thinker in history, he upset a lot of people and was often on the run to evade persecution. But more than that, I think Rousseau was a tremendously sensitive, in some ways tormented individual personally. He was always something of an outsider looking in on society. And it's arguable, really, that this had a positive effect on his philosophy because this isolation, this social isolation that he made for himself, it's fair to say, and with his ideas, ostracizing other people and making himself generally unpopular, this isolation helped give Rousseau a different perspective on the social world. Rousseau was always an outsider looking in. Now, in 1750, Rousseau reached the moment that would later define his life. He discovered that the Academy of Dijon in France had launched an essay writing competition. The Academy set a specific question: has the restoration of the sciences and arts contributed to the purification of morals? The Academy expected to get essays which celebrated the expansion of scientific knowledge and the growth in the power of human reason that was rife at this time. We are in the middle of the Enlightenment period. And I think that France, being the center perhaps of the Enlightenment, although there is significant contribution from British thinkers, France was generally considered to be the center of the Enlightenment, and the University of Dijon was expecting some sort of kind of nationalistic celebration of French greatness, perhaps, and certainly the greatness of the age. But what they got from Rousseau was something different. And actually, Rousseau went on to win first prize in the competition. Rousseau used to like to take solitary walks in the countryside. He writes about this a lot. He appreciated the sheer wonder of nature. And he would later stress the importance of feelings and emotions, which ran, of course, counter to the increasingly colder and detached approach that was being advocated with the scientific revolution that was then well underway during the Enlightenment. And of course, this made Rousseau an important influence on the 18th century Romantic movement in art, literature, and indeed philosophy. And one of the key themes of the Romanticists was the claim that it is just as important to discover what is on the inside of us as what is on the outside in the outside world. Science, of course, was and still is, committed to discovering the world outside us. And it was neglecting, for Rousseau at least, it was neglecting the world on the inside of us. It neglected the human condition. In fact, it almost, one could say, suppressed the human condition. And that's what appealed, this is what appealed to the Romanticists, this release of the inner person, this release of the inner man, a truer, more natural man. And this idea began to infuse Rousseau's mind. Now, he considered the Dijon Academy's essay question while out on one of these solitary walks that he used to like to take. And he noticed, he says, how there seemed to be a beautiful balance and harmony and rhythm to nature, and how the opposite seemed to be true of human society. And he describes breaking into a sweat and having to sit under a tree to kind of compose himself as all these ideas suddenly entered his mind. It's almost like a religious experience that he describes. It's like a sort of revelation where he sits under a tree out in nature on his own with all these ideas flooding into his mind. And he says he broke into a kind of a sweat, and he rushed right home, inspired to write this essay and enter it into the competition. Now, this essay, which, as I say, won the Dijon Academy Award, would be later published in 1754 as the Discourse on the Origin and Basis of Inequality Among Men. In this work, Rousseau argues that the progression of the sciences and arts has caused the corruption of virtue and morality. Not increased it, but caused the corruption of virtue and morality. The opposite, really, of what was implied in the essay title. And his foundational argument ran that humans were basically good creatures by nature. However, humans have become corrupted by the complex development of society through history. And you can see how this idea may have, later on perhaps, you'll see how this idea may have had some influence on Hegel's thinking. But what Rousseau argued was that social existence had gradually led men away from their true nature. The startling claim is therefore that as human society develops and becomes more sophisticated and more elaborate culturally, technologically, basic human goodness and simple virtues decline. So what we would consider to be progression, historical progression, corresponds to human moral regression, according to Rousseau. Now, I should have said to you, please start your PowerPoint that I've accompanied this accompanies this lecture, and it's to be found on Moodle. So we're on PowerPoint 2 now, please, if you wouldn't mind turning to that. Now, Rousseau was truly appalled by the material inequality caused by the spread of John Locke's doctrine of property accumulation. Rousseau becomes one of Locke's great antagonists. The outcome for society, argued Rousseau, was the very opposite of its theoretical intention. So Locke had somehow let loose forces in his ideas which had led to societal changes of which Rousseau did not approve. On the basis of Locke's version of freedom, society had actually become a place of inequality and oppression for everyone. So what starts off as equality and freedom for everyone ends up in a society that is unequal and unfree. But this did not merely apply to the poor and the disadvantaged, he argues. It applies to the rich also. So whilst the poor envied the rich were made less secure on the basis of that envy. So this seems to be a truism that he's discovered here. As soon as you have more, materially that is, than someone else, other people become envious of you, and they become envious of your position of advantage within society. then you start to worry because other people are coveting what you possess, and so that makes you feel insecure. In a way, I suppose he does revisit one of Hobbes's ideas in this regard. That insecurity between men is this sort of, scramble over resources and so forth. So, but what he's basically saying here is that both the sort of winners and losers in this unequal society are suffering, but probably in different ways. So even if you've got a lot of social advantages, you are not free. You're not free. And he goes on to say that if one member of society is disadvantaged, then the whole of society is unfree. But we'll gain an understanding of what he means by all this as we go along. So for Rousseau, then, to begin with, he tears into John Locke's ideas that they've been so damaging for society. They created conditions which have become so damaging. So he exposes something of a paradox here. Under Locke's doctrine, men begin free but end up unfree. And this contradiction arises because the meaning of freedom is not properly understood by Locke. The entire dimension Locke is missing is the social, according to Rousseau. Locke sees society as a collection of individuals, atomic particles, with no essential linkages to each other. Society, therefore, is an aggregation of individuals doing their own thing. Very much as Margaret Thatcher described, there is no such thing as society, there are only individuals and families. Very much a kind of a Lockean idea here. There is no such thing as society, there is only individuals. So society as such is just a collection of individuals with no necessary connections or indeed responsibilities to one another. So society only exists to that extent for Locke. But Rousseau, by contrast, begins to picture society as a thing in itself, as indeed socialists do in general. And so Rousseau's often credited as being an early socialist thinker. So society is beginning to be depicted by Rousseau as being a thing in itself over and above the individual. So it's already there, and to which the individual becomes a member. And any doctrine that leaves out the needs of the whole of society will have a terrible consequence for the health of that society, argues Rousseau. Society as a whole will suffer. And importantly, if society as a whole suffers, the individuals within it will suffer too. So Rousseau turns it round. The individual is not the starting point of society as it is for Locke. Society is the starting point of the individual. The truth of the matter is, if you want to find freedom in society, then you must firstly seek ways to make society free. So Rousseau's arguing that a free society is not made up of free individuals. Free individuals are made up from a free society. So society determines the individual, not the other way around. So it's not enough to do what Locke did and simply make individuals free, because you've ended up with this condition of unfreedom. So another way to say this is, if you want to find freedom for yourself, living in a society of other men, you must consider your freedom tied up with the freedom of everyone else. So your freedom is linked to the freedom of others in society. So you simply cannot be free if your neighbor is not free. So if one person in society, as I've said, is not free, then no one is free. A very interesting idea. Now let's look at PowerPoint number 3. Now this is a scene from Kevin Costner, the film Dances with Wolves, which I think captures a sort of Rousseau-esque theme. Locke's ideas on material property had been taken to the Americas by the white settlers from Europe. Native Americans had no concept of property. This was something that was completely alien to the Native Americans. They didn't live that way. They didn't live with possessions and ownership. And of course, when the settlers arrived, they dispossessed the Indians. Although the Indians didn't, the Native American Indians didn't possess as such, but it was land that they'd been living on. And Locke, of course, argued that land that is not being exploited as property is land going to waste. So there's more or less an open invitation for people to go to foreign countries where there was no concept of land ownership and slap an ownership claim on it. And of course, this was land that for centuries had been occupied by Native Americans. For Native Americans, nature, there was no ownership. Nature was simply borrowed and always returned for the next generation. It was simply borrowed by those that were alive. It had been borrowed by the people that had lived previously and passed on to future generations, as indeed the current generation will pass it on to future generations. There's no such thing as ownership. So the European settlers believed, though, that the native Indians were savages, and they themselves were civilized, and what they were bringing to America was civilization. But what, as Rousseau sees it, this is the classic idea that he's got. The settlers weren't bringing civilization as much as greed and corruption. These things were being introduced into the Americas that they discovered. So as America was being opened up, it brought about the destruction of the values of the Native Americans and introduced European type values that had a corrupting influence over American society. And of course, it gradually drove the Indians out of existence. Now, the particular scene where the buffaloes have been killed, actually, this was a gentleman by the name of Buffalo Bill. He was a great buffalo hunter who used to kill the buffaloes merely for their tongues, which was a bit of a delicacy back in the East Coast, New York and so forth. There was a great market for buffalo tongues, and so he was slaughtering buffaloes more or less just for their tongues and sending them back to New York and making money out of it. It was leaving the rest of the buffalo in the condition that you see. And of course, the buffalo had been the food source for the Native Americans for centuries. And of course, they only took as much as they needed from nature. They never overexploited nature, but along came these white settlers with their profit motive and their concept of ownership and so forth. And so the process of destruction began. This is a very Rousseau-esque idea that is being employed in the film Dances with Wolves. So let's turn now to PowerPoint number 4, please. Now, in this essay, The Origin of Inequality, Rousseau attacks Locke's concept of property. Yes, property is the cause of social inequality and all social ills. But how does it get started? Well, Rousseau states this. He says, the first man who, having fenced in a piece of land, said, "This is mine," and found people naive enough to believe him, you are undone if you once forget that the fruits of the earth belong to us all and the earth itself to no one. I'm going to read that again because in the context of the last slide, it's so important, because what Locke had done basically is validated the carving up of this huge, great new American country, this new continent, more or less given the philosophical justification to divide up this new land and for people to stake claims on it. And this is precisely what they did. The first man who, having fenced in a piece of land, said, "This is mine," and found people naive enough to believe him, you are undone if you once forget that the fruits of the earth belong to us all and the earth itself to nobody. So everything on the earth belongs to everyone, and yet no one. This is what Rousseau is saying. This is a central theme in his idea. And I think there's some intrinsic beauty in that idea, actually, that something's gone badly wrong here with property, and it's caused all kinds of problems in the world. It's because we've forgotten that the fruits of the earth belong to no one and the earth itself, or the fruits of the earth belong to us all and the earth itself to nobody. Well, entirely dissimilar from what Locke was saying about how nature is there for all of us to exploit. But something had gone badly wrong, because as Rousseau says, as soon as you put a fence around a piece of land and said, this is mine, you're actually denying other people access to it. That's the point that Rousseau is offended by, the fact that you are denying other people its use. So, for Rousseau, it's just inconceivable that you could possibly own land. It's a gift from God. It's not ours to take and to restrict other people from having and enjoying. We simply can't do this. So this has got to be based on some sort of ultimate falsehood. There's an ultimate lie here, that we've got this natural entitlement to claim a stake on nature and to deny other people access to it. So, for Rousseau, even if property acquisition is based on an individual effort and industry, as Locke argued it should be, it's still, for Rousseau, not morally valid. This is because any seizure of any unowned part of the earth amounts effectively to theft. Because this idea, all property is theft, would feed itself into the thinking of the utopian socialists of the early 19th century in France. All property is theft. So it's a seizure of something that belongs to no one and everyone at the same time. And so essentially what's happening here is a crime. This seizing of property and denying other people access to it is essentially a crime. So for Rousseau, the claim to any property that exists in nature is impossible morally unless this was done with the consent of all of mankind. I mean, if all of mankind agrees to it, then Rousseau says, yes, okay, own land if everybody else gives their permission, because it belongs to everyone. And unless everyone gives their permission, then it's essentially a crime. It's immoral. But then he goes on to say, well, but securing this permission is not possible. It's not feasible to ask everyone in the world whether you could have that land. But the thing about it really is that you would have to also include those people who are not yet born. Because if the idea that nature belongs to no one and that you simply borrow it, then you're going to pass it on to the next generation. But the next generation cannot be asked when you're taking land. They can't be consulted and asked for their permission because they've not yet been born. But when they are born, they'll be born into a world where property distribution has already been ordered and settled. And therefore they will be born into a corrupt world. So it doesn't matter how you play it. The right to own nature on some would-be permanent basis is a moral impossibility for Rousseau. And this idea on property, of course, is central to socialism and the idea of common ownership. And so Rousseau certainly had an impact on socialist thought here. Now, PowerPoint number 5. Here we're going to talk about Rousseau's method, which is interesting and different from the kind of method that we've been talking about in previous weeks. He employs what is called the a priori, or deductive method. And this is a form of rationalism, which is the opposite of empiricism. Empiricism is the exploration, the observation of the world using the sensory faculties that we possess, the 5 sensory faculties. You don't need me to go over them again, but rationalism is different. We use the mind and the capacity for reason to determine truth and reality. This is the a priori deductive method in Rousseau's hands. So reason is used in Rousseau's case to draw conclusions about humans and their society. It's still a deductive method, is still used in science, but it employs pure reason in Rousseau's case. So he rejects empiricism as a source of truth. At best, empiricism will lie to you, and we'll see why in a minute. So his argument is based on the employment of logic, and this logic, as we shall see, is quite ingenious. So he deduces, he reasons that there once existed humans in conditions that were close to nature. Well, we heard Hobbes argue that, and we heard Locke argue that too. But Rousseau argues that humans once existed in nature, and they don't exist in that nature now. This was utterly lost on the empiricists like Locke and Hobbes, because no one in their societies lived like this anymore. And so how can an empiricist who's basing his truth assumptions on the empirical observation of the world around him, how can he possibly know that there was once a condition of humans living in a condition of nature that was no longer with us? Because obviously the empirical method couldn't reveal that to you. So this truth cannot be seen. Empiricism, therefore, argues Rousseau, can't penetrate into the past, once, that is, the physical evidence of the previous way of life has gone. So once that's gone and you can't see it anymore, there's no way with the empirical method that you can possibly claim that there once existed people who lived this way. And yet, for Rousseau, there were hints. There were empirical hints in the world that this early way of life was still pursued in other places in the world, and we've seen the example of the North American Indians. Now, from the reports of navigators and adventurers, there were people in other parts of the world, say on the islands in the Pacific Ocean, who still lived a very simple existence, and were much closer to what Rousseau would conceive of as the original man than we are living in more sophisticated European societies. So there were people in the world who were living in more simpler communities, and the reports from these travelers and adventurers on the high seas all told of a people who seemed to be happy. They seemed to be happy, they seemed to be friendly and largely carefree, laid back people who didn't seem to be so worried and stressed and so forth about life and living as people in Europe were. And we're talking now about Rousseau's Europe, which was 300 or over 300 years ago, let alone the Europe that we've got today, which is, probably 10 times worse than it was in Rousseau's time. But it's a very familiar argument, isn't it, when Rousseau talks in this way, that there are people who live a simple existence in faraway places, and they seem to be happy and carefree, even though their lives are very simple, and to us, they don't have a lot of scope for what we would consider to be an advanced standard of living, and yet underneath it, they seem to be more happier than us. This is a curiosity, to say the least. But Rousseau concluded, partly from this idea that he's received of reports on the Native American Indians and peoples that live in places like the South Sea Islands of the Pacific and so forth, but also on the basis of his reasoning, that he concludes from this that there must have been a condition once in which all humanity lived this way, or indeed in a pre-socialized existence. And I'll come to that in a minute. But what has intervened is the rise of so-called civilization. And civilization really, in this sense, is just another way of describing a society of men. But Rousseau argues, therefore, that if we were once in a natural condition and now we're living in something different, the something different that we refer to, this so-called civilization, must be an artificial condition. And of course, here, like the other social contract theorists, he does see society and indeed government and state as artificial. So he's in agreement on that much with Hobbes and Locke. But he argues that there must have been a time prior, though, to society and this so-called civilization that we talk about, in which men lived more natural lives. So he's got this idea that society is unnatural, and so there must have been a point in time when society got started and began to unnaturalize us. But before that, we must have been living natural lives. I mean, when human existence first came into being on Earth, and we've got archaeological observation of this, yes, early man living on Earth and so forth. We know that there were primitive societies, but Rousseau argues that we can't really have started in this way. It seems to him that there must have been a pre-social condition. There must have been a point when society didn't exist and before society actually took off. And he describes this world as being populated by what is often dubbed the noble savage, although Rousseau didn't actually use this term himself. The noble savage, but the term is a reasonable one. I don't suppose Rousseau would have any complaints with it. Now, this noble savage was once a man who lived according to the laws of nature, directly dictated to him, not those laws of society, the laws of nature. And this is before societies ever existed. Now, of course, Hobbes or Locke would look at this and say, well, you can't prove scientifically that such a man ever existed. Well, of course, this is where the a priori method kicks in. Rousseau argues that only by reasoning that this noble savage once existed can we proceed really to have any understanding of the problems that we've created in modern society. So Rousseau's taking us back to what he regards as an authentically original man living in a state of nature. So notice the difference then between Hobbes and Locke's empirical scientific method. They both posit theories of human nature based on the societies they knew, and they drew their observations from that society. So in other words, they transferred to their idea of nature ideas they already acquired in society through the observation of society. And so therefore they extrapolated their opinions on natural man from the man that was already socialized. So instead of getting a true picture of man in a true condition of nature, all previous philosophers, argued Rousseau, were really only describing the already socialized man. That was the man that was revealed to their empirical methods. And he argues, Rousseau says that previous thinkers have tried to get back to nature, but none of them got there. So if society is an artificial creation, as Rousseau believed, and not natural at all, everything that comes out of that society will be artificial too, including our theories about nature. You see the point he's getting across here? Let me say it again. If society is an artificial creation, as Rousseau believed it is, and it's not natural, it's impossible to reach a natural position based on and from within that society. Everything that comes out of that society will be artificial too. And Rousseau refers to this product of society as artifice. Artifice. It's distorted. It's artificial, but not only that, it's distorted. And so a distorted society will produce distorted products. Everything that comes out, the arts, the philosophy, the science, the politics, everything will be subject to the original corrupted aspect that society brings to everything that we think. And this idea, of course, impacts on Marx and Engels' phrase, of course, the idea of ideology as false consciousness. Why? Because the basic idea under capitalism, society is distorted by capitalism, and so what we think, our ideological view and take of reality will be distorted too. And I think we can trace that very fundamental idea back to Rousseau. So a noteworthy idea here is that a distorted society produces a distorted view of itself. Artifice, as Rousseau called it. Now, Rousseau sees so-called human nature as not fixed, as completely malleable, and indeed, of course, socially manufactured, because somehow man had been taken from his primitive self, which we'll look at in a minute, and the details of which we'll look at in a minute, and turned into a social creature. And in the process of that, of course, he'd been corrupted. And that suggests to Rousseau that there is no original nature as such. Human nature is something which is simply learned from one's environment. So there's no such thing as a fixed human nature. People like Machiavelli got that completely wrong. I mean, if Machiavelli's ideas are anything, then they are a product of the distortions of the Renaissance world in which he lived and the political intrigues of the Italian peninsula. So humans are adaptable, and they attempt to meet the needs of survival. And of course, that just depends what environment we're talking about surviving in, as we shall see. But primitive man, our noble savage, he adapted to nature directly. He had a direct communication with nature. He hadn't been taken away from nature. This was natural man. So the early man was adapted to nature just as social man now today is adapted to society, with all the terrible consequences that involves. So in this sense, man in nature adapted to natural conditions, and socialized man adapted to artificial conditions. Now in this sense, natural man is indeed a product of nature. So this is our true, authentic natural man that Rousseau has reason to exist, which we can't see anymore. He's gone, but there are still hints in the world that of a man who was like that. But socialized man, by contrast, will logically be a product of society. In other words, Rousseau seizes on this idea that human nature is actually manufactured by society itself. And of course, Hobbes and Locke's theory of human nature really is utterly manufactured. A man-made construction, artifice. So, for example, the wickedness that Hobbes saw in natural man, in his version of natural man, was actually an artificial man. Or what Hobbes thought was his man in nature was in actual fact a man who'd already been socialized, an artificial man, not a natural man at all, a socially constructed person. And so the problems of Hobbes' state of nature actually is one of social manufacture and not of one natural condition. And of course, the reason for this contrast between Rousseau and Hobbes here is obviously down to one of method and approach and how we discover the truth. So Rousseau, well, when he talks about a natural human condition, he can only therefore refer to a point before society got started. If society is the problem here, then our natural man must be pre-social. He has to have existed and have developed a character before society developed. Because thereafter, obviously, human nature became distorted, it became changed, contaminated. It became contaminated and poisoned by society. So, for this reason, it's impossible to say exactly what this nature is like as a scientific fact, of course, but we can reason what the state of nature was like. And this, of course, is what Rousseau does. So if you turn to now slide 6, let's talk about this state of nature in a bit more detail. Very interesting ideas that he's got too. Now, Rousseau spurred really in writing this essay for the Dijon Academy by the inequality that he's seen around him in European society, particularly French society, which he's got a lot of contempt for. This is pre-revolutionary France, by the way, which was a dreadfully unequal society with aristocrats that lived lives of absolute opulence and luxury and grinding poverty for the mass of the public. So Rousseau was very taken by inequality, the inequality that he saw around him. Now, he therefore is intrigued as to the origin of this inequality. And he begins by distinguishing between human inequalities based on natural abilities, natural inequalities as they were, as one could describe them, natural abilities of the mind and the body. These will be accidents of nature. There will be differences between men in their natural abilities. But these, argue Rousseau, are accidents of nature. And they're never of any great importance. I mean, man is roughly equal, he thinks. The differentials, the enormous differences that he saw in the society around him, therefore, were socially generated and not natural. They weren't a product of natural differences or accidents of nature. So inequalities have to be, the inequalities that he saw, particularly these gross inequalities, they have to be socially generated. So there's it begins by making this distinction between natural inequality and artificial or man-made inequality. So artificial inequality then only arises when humans are drawn into society. No one, therefore, is born a master. No one is born a slave or a servant. There is no justification in nature for this. Well, I suppose in this regard, he does agree this far with what Locke said about that. That no one has been placed at the subservience of another human being under the laws of nature. Well, that's certainly something that Rousseau agrees with in Locke. So there's no justification for this, and all this is an artificial product of society, all this inequality. But the trouble is with this socially generated artificial inequality, is it becomes mistaken for natural inequality. It's as though, well, what we're seeing is only a more developed and more civilized version of the sort of inequalities that would occur in nature. Well, Rousseau rejects that idea. But what he says about artifice, and to go back to what we were saying earlier about the distorted product of a distorted society, that what we've done is the facts of social inequality, the facts of social existence have been justified in various false ways. And so again, he hints here that, of course, there's a sort of a cultural ideology which forms around these social inequalities, material inequalities. There's an ideology that forms around them, which seek to justify them. And of course, that for its time is a very brilliant idea. And it would be Antonio Gramsci, really, in the 20th century that would really put some flesh on the bones of that idea. So anyway, let's get down to have a look at this state of nature. What's it like? Well, Rousseau says of man in a state of nature, and I quote, "I see him satisfying his hunger under an oak, quenching his thirst at the first stream, finding his bed under the same tree which provided his meal, and behold, his needs are furnished." Well, this is a man living a very simple existence, but it's also an existence in which he can easily satisfy his needs. And so he hasn't got this terrible ambition and competitivity, because actually the environment in which he occupies provides for his needs. So he's not all stressed out about providing for his needs. This is a man who finds simple solutions to the problems of his existence. So man's needs were simple, and nature provided for them. All this primitive man was required to do was to become in harmony with his natural environment. He needed to develop physical strength, promote good health and techniques for survival. And you imagine he would have been highly adept at living with nature. He would have known which kind of mushrooms were edible and which were poisonous, and where to locate fruit and berries and so forth. He would have been highly adept at living in this condition of nature. The techniques of survival he would have mastered. So he was naturally equipped like the animals. And Rousseau actually describes a human being as an ingenious machine, perfectly equipped to survive in nature. And in many ways, this man was more accomplished than so-called civilized man. And civilized man had forgotten his natural survival techniques. And there's I think it's in the book Emile, in which Rousseau discusses education, in which the teacher says to Emile, think about being alone on a desert island. And of course, slightly before Rousseau wrote his discourse, Robinson Crusoe had been written by Daniel Defoe, an English writer, describing a man who was alone on a desert island. And Rousseau says, well, imagine half these people in their wigs and their silks and their fineries who walk around the streets of Paris. Imagine what they would be like washed up on a desert island. It wouldn't last 5 minutes. And so who's the superior being here? Our natural man, you could put him on that desert island, and before long he would have sorted out all the resources that were available to him according to nature, and he would have adapted himself to his environment, and he would survive. Our man from the street in Paris, our sophisticated aristocrat with all his perfume and his handkerchiefs, he'd be dead within a matter of days. So I think that's a very, very interesting idea, isn't it? He's really sort of cocking a snoop at society here, isn't he? So our civilized man has forgotten natural survival techniques. And we've learned to survive in a different environment, which has been socially generated. It's a different kind of jungle. So our primitive ancestors were not made soft. They were tough. And they hadn't become dependent on society and luxuries and technological progress. They had no need to acquire machines and other comforts for their survival. These primitive men had little to fear from the animal kingdom either. Rousseau says they got better wits and they got sharper intelligence than the animals, and they could judge whether to fight or to take flight, or indeed to equip themselves with weapons, something that animals don't in general do. The only real enemies that these primitive men had, were those over which they only had limited control, and that was old age and illness. So apart from that, our primitive man wasn't living in a condition of fear at all. He was adapted to his environment. He was tough. He was astute in his own way and conditioned completely for his own survival in his own environment. The only things that would frighten him is just something that cannot be removed from us, and of course, and that is the fear of death and old age and injury and illness. But provided you can do things which would keep you or minimize the risk in this regard anyway, as we'll see now, that you can actually live a natural life and probably you'll be a lot healthier as a result of it. And I always think when I'm giving these lectures, when I picture this man in my mind, this primitive man, I always think of the Tarzan movies where Tarzan grew up in the jungle, raised by gorillas or apes or something, wasn't it? This man with muscular and strong and physically imposing. And of course, a very healthy individual too, because just don't go in for all the vices that society has given us. So Rousseau, I think he produces a great idea here. Artificial living in society gives us artificial problems. For example, the health problems. For example, mental illnesses such as depression is wholly a product of social living. This is an interesting idea, isn't it? Depression really is wholly a product of social living for one reason or another. So too are illnesses like, obviously, things like obesity, high blood pressure, diabetes, which often results from overindulgence of rich foods, too much sugar, too much fat and oil, maybe smoking and alcoholic drink and so forth. Overindulgences, and so we created a lot of our illnesses artificially. So like everything else that comes out of the distorted society, we've also distorted our own health and given rise to illnesses which the natural living and the natural man the noble savage never experienced. The noble savage would not have experienced depression simply because he had no idea what depression is. This is something that's socially manufactured. I think this is a brilliant idea, particularly when you think that the drug company that makes Prozac, for example, is making a fortune convincing Americans that they're unhappy and that they're in need of this drug. And it's typical of the sort of distortion that Rousseau would say comes out of our artificial society with all its artificial problems. And now he's gone on to say artificial diseases as well. And I really kind of like this idea that he's got. Now, modern man, whether he's socially advantaged or disadvantaged, have built around him, according to Rousseau, all the causes of his own suffering. I think this is the point that he's trying to get across. Modern medicine here was therefore an industry created to remedy artificial, socially induced illnesses. So the big pharma, the multi-million industry now convincing us that we need to take this and that and producing things for curing illnesses that are largely brought about by society in the first place. I think a brilliant idea, and as I said to you at the beginning, how Rousseau was able to stand outside of society. I think it's a breathtaking idea, really, to be able to put yourself out of the system to such an extent and looking in on it, and to make observations like that. So Rousseau reasons here that in a state of nature, well, not only were men essentially healthy, fit and strong, they were also morally uncorrupted. They were essentially good, they were essentially kind, and they were essentially benevolent creatures. Well, what a different version of natural man from what Hobbes was saying. Men, argues Rousseau, that didn't harm each other because they had no need to harm each other. There were no fights over possessions because no one possessed anything. Hence there was no greed, there was no selfishness, there was no envy. And of course, if you're subject to, you're one of society's losers, and you're looking at everybody who's more successful than you, then you begin to suffer from depression. Something that our natural man, primitive man, did not experience. And so, primitive man, we're talking about a pre-socialized man here. And as pre-socialized, of course, it follows that he was a solitary figure, wandering alone, except to make children. Well, something like Rousseau himself, actually. Rousseau liked these walks in nature because he felt, when he was in nature, and I have to say that I've experienced this myself, when he's alone in nature, he feels this sort of mystical attachment somehow. He just feels nature is recharging him and energizing him. He feels that he's in rhythm with nature somehow. Men would have lived this solitary existence, wandering alone, can in a relationship with nature, alone only, with the exception of coming together to make children. And after making children, our primitive man simply wandered off like another animal would do, and abandon the children to the mother. And he did precisely that with 6 of his children, who ended up in orphanages, which was considered to be, I have to say, I consider it to be kind of a cruel act to produce 6 children and have them all put into an orphanage. An orphanage must have been a pretty awful place for the kids to go, certainly at any time, but certainly during Rousseau's time. But it's consistent with with Rousseau's philosophy here, that the natural man would not have congregated in a family. He wouldn't have hung around. He would have made some female pregnant and simply wandered off. Maybe there are men today who live in that natural condition. But what he's trying to say is that primitive man had no social relations because society was not necessary for him. So Rousseau's making the point that we only enter into society when it became necessary. And our primitive man was well equipped to survive on his own in nature. But having said that, the point that I would like to get across was that Rousseau nonetheless felt that he was well disposed to other men. He would sooner help someone else than harm them. And Rousseau reasons this because he says that men are sensitive to other men's suffering. And this is an idea, of course, that he shares with David Hume, with whom he shared some accommodation for a short period of time when Rousseau had to escape from Europe persecution. And so Rousseau is an advocate of this idea that humans are innately empathetic, that we've got this capacity, even our primitive man who's not yet learned anything other than those things that he needs for his own survival. He does have this innate natural capacity, argues Rousseau, something that seems to be not necessary for him to learn. An innate capacity, therefore, something that he's born with, this capacity for empathy, this capacity to put himself in someone else's shoes, to imagine how someone else feels. So this is part of the reason why men were well disposed to each other. They weren't in competition because they didn't need each other for anything. They were self-sufficient. So that they weren't in competition over that. And when they did run into each other, they were well disposed to each other because they were well enough equipped with empathy to understand how that other person was acting. And so that if they saw another man in trouble, they would sooner help that person than hurt them. And he agrees with Locke that all men were in a condition of equality within nature and before nature, but the society that's grown up now has changed all that. Rousseau says that primitive man knew neither deference nor contempt for other men. Primitive man had no social life and was not therefore stratified into society or allotted a social status. Now, of course, this made primitive man morally and physically strong. It made him sharp-witted, but more than anything, it made him independent. Our primitive man was independent and therefore truly free. The noble savage had no language because he had no need for language. Language is a product of society, socialization, and society is impossible without it. But in our pre-social conditions, he didn't really need language. But as soon as he gains language by entering into society, the problem with language is it's then used as a tool to manipulate his mind. And certainly to manipulate his mind to the extent that somehow society is able to justify all its vices and problems, such as inequality. So for Rousseau to pick up a book on philosophy would be something that he would condemn, because in those pages, in those sophisticated words, in those clever arguments, we're being fooled. We're being fooled. Our reality is being distorted. And so he was very suspicious about language and the communication of language. He was very suspicious about, for example, plays and theatre, and he condemned it for being part of the corruption process. Language very much part of the corruption process, because it's used to ingeniously affect the way that we think. And primitive man was not immoral. He was simply amoral, like an animal is. How can you say that a dog or cat is immoral or moral? When a cat catches a mouse, my cat used to catch a mouse, and it kind of upset me. This little creature was, terrified of the big cat and so forth. And but how can I say to the cat, "You are being immoral"? He would look at me saying, "What are you talking about?" Well, Rousseau's got a similar idea for our primitive man. It's no good talking about morality because he doesn't know what morality is. What are you asking? He doesn't know morality because he's got no need of morality. His morality is simply to stay alive in nature, for which he's designed, or he's perfected his own skills. So he's got no need for morality. This is the point, and it's no good saying that, well, this creature was immoral somehow, because it's simply outside of the scope of the linguistic term, moral or immoral. He was simply outside of that. So society has manufactured what we would regard as morality. It's not something that's outside of us. Again, a brilliant idea by Rousseau. So morality, it doesn't come from anywhere other than it's of social manufacture. I suppose one could go on to say that indeed religion itself would fit into that category. Religion, in this sense, as not so much as an attempt to kind of illustrate the existence of a creator, which is very much a personal opinion, but it's when religion becomes a doctrine of how to live, then it becomes loaded with morality. And what we're talking about with morality are actually, what we refer to with morality is a set of rules by which we live, isn't it? Well, it's these rules which, of course, for Rousseau are artificial. And so we can say, in this sense, that morality is artificial. Our pre-socialized primitive man was outside of the framework of the moral discussion altogether. So you can't use a phrase like moral in trying to evaluate that person, because that person had no awareness of what morality is any more than a cat or dog. So whilst Rousseau is saying that our primitive man was in some ways superior to socialized man, Rousseau is at the same time suggesting that the primitive man is not much more than an animal. It has to be said that he's got the virtues of an animal. His purpose in life is simple. He doesn't agitate his mind any more than a dog or cat would. He doesn't take on complex problems. He doesn't get depressed any more than a cat or dog does. He doesn't get anxious any more than a cat or dog does. His life is simple, and he's adapted to his own survival. But this creature is not much more than an animal. But there's a certain innocence to this creature, as there is an innocence to all animals. Actually, they're not corrupted, are they? They're simply in touch with nature. Nature has given them their characters in this regard, and so one can't say that a bear is moral or immoral. It's just a ridiculous concept to try to employ on animals. And so these animals have a certain sort of pre-morality. They've got a certain innocence. They've not reached that stage yet. So what you see is what you get with them. They are what they are. A dog is a dog is a dog. And of course, I've had friends say to me, well, I like animals a lot more than human beings. I've heard people say that to me. I actually like animals more than I like human beings. Human beings let you down. They're untrustworthy. Whereas an animal will never betray you. An animal will never lie to you or try to cheat you. You see, there was this sort of, these things have been acquired in society when we interact with other men. All these vices and problems have arisen in our interaction with other men in society. Whereas these animals, they don't go in for deceit, whereas human beings do. And of course, language, of course, as I mentioned, is very much a part of this, essential to it. Now, just as a domestic animal, when you domesticate an animal, they lose their instincts for survival if you do that. And so if you raise a wild animal, a young wild animal, in captivity, and you release them into the wild, very often they don't survive. They can't survive because they're just not adapted to that environment. Well, Rousseau says something similar about our human civilization today. We've lost the skills to live that way. And so there's no chance of going back to living that way again. But men are also, well, this primitive man was like an animal in many regards. He had all the virtues of an animal. Men differ from animals, and they're not governed solely by an instinct for survival. A dog knows that it needs to survive, but he doesn't quite know why. He's not self-consciously thinking about why he responds in the way that he does, whereas men are capable of doing that. So men have a faculty to rationalize and seek improvements in their lives based on a free will, one might say. So they're not governed by the simple laws of instinct as animals are. Man is more reflective. And this is in some ways, though, to their disadvantage, argues Rousseau, this capacity for reflection. Because men have the capacity through reflection to deviate from nature in ways that are not good for them. This seems to be proven to be true in society. So Rousseau is saying the question of choice and free will, which Locke thinks are subject to natural laws and natural rights, they can actually be employed to harm us. We can harm ourselves through our claim to be living in a naturalized existence, making free choices. We can make choices which are bad for us. So in this sense, the human intellect and the process of calculation can result in miscalculation. And our miscalculations then can cause us to act against our best interests. Now, this primitive man must have begun the process of socialization at some stage, reasoning that there were advantages to be had by doing it. But he gradually, argues Rousseau, gave away all his freedoms. And he gradually gave away most of his advantages. And he ends up, actually, once he's become socialized, he ends up being dependent on society. He's no longer independent. And Rousseau regards that as being a type of slavery. The primitive man, once he formed or volunteered himself into society, he ends up being enslaved by that society. This is a gradual process. It's not something that happens overnight, but this is what's happened. So men have given up their natural freedoms. Men have given up their natural advantages and gained new social advantages, which are now acting against their interests. So here, the social contract, this informal social contract, once made by primitive man in entering into society, it has proved to be a very bad deal for him. PowerPoint number 7, please. Now, Rousseau sees man leaving the state of nature as the starting point of human history. So before that, we're talking about prehistory. The starting point of human history is society. So history is a process of development away from nature and man's natural virtues. As he becomes more and more dependent on society, he becomes more and more drawn into it, he becomes more and more captivated by it. The effect of this is that society has gradually corrupted men and indeed made them wicked. So again, the point made is that Hobbes' state of nature, actually what Hobbes was describing was society and not nature at all. Whereas sort of Rousseau is saying that you have peace in nature, and now you've socialized people in the way that they've been socialized. That is the cause of their misery. So civilization, as it has developed, is the cause of human misery. Now, the development of unequal social relations had produced in the minds of people an awareness of human differences. Now, these differences are socially manufactured, but are mistakenly ascribed to natural causes, as I said before. For example, Rousseau sees society as creating in man his own opinion of himself. With socialized man, humans are subject to the opinions of others. They then internalize an opinion of themselves they derive from others. Now, in a state of nature, things were different. Men had a natural self-love, a natural self-love that kept you alive. It helped you to survive. Why do I go on living? It's because we've all of us got a self-love. Well, in nature, in a state of nature, our primitive man had something Rousseau calls amour de soi, which was a natural self-love. It kept him alive, and his opinion of himself was one that was wholly from within himself. It was part of his independence from others, and he had natural esteem, self-esteem, and this was not dependent on others. But in society, this innocent self-love is replaced by what Rousseau calls amour propre. Amour propre. Amour propre is self-esteem based on the opinions of others in society. So we're now in a position in society, we're having given up our independence, we're now dependent on our view of ourselves from what society judges us to be. So we internalize our own self-esteem as a gift, as it were, from the rest of society. And of course, in this sense, what we think of ourselves is wholly socially constructed, and our self-esteem in society will have been corrupted away from the amour de soi to amour propre, which will be really the symbolic of the status that we've got in society. And in that regard, of course, our wealth and our possessions would be very fundamental. So in society, we adopt a new kind of love of self that and we've abandoned the old kind of self-love, which was a sort of like an internal support system that we had. We've crushed that. We've crushed amour de soi, and now society's replaced it with amour propre, a self-love that comes from society itself. And so we're judging ourselves. We come to opinion of ourselves passively. That opinion is given to us by the rest of society. And so we come to a subjective opinion of ourselves from the objective opinion of the world outside of us. So man judges himself, of course, if society is artificial, he judges himself and he loves himself artificially too, on the notion of success, particularly, of course, in this regard, symbolic of success would be property. So man then becomes dependent on others for his own self-esteem or what other people think of him. This is a rather sad event, isn't it? If you think about it, when you walk through the streets of London these days and you see people sleeping in doorways. Well, you know, the first thought that comes into your mind is that that's a person that sort of dropped through the system. But can you imagine the amour propre that person must be feeling, looking up from his position at the bottom of society, looking up at the rest of us? He sees himself where he is, and he evaluates, more to the point, he evaluates himself on the basis of where he is according to this artificial social construction of who he is. So opinion Your own opinion of yourself comes from your social status. More appropriate. Again, an absolutely belter of an idea from Rousseau. Now, just to return to language, he finds that society is characterized by language, although he's unsure of its source. But however one conceives of it, language and society must go together. Language becomes a framework for understanding within the community. But he's not sure which came first. It's one of those chicken and egg type problems. Which came first, the chicken or the egg? Which came first, society or language? Well, clearly, somehow they must develop together. So our understandings and concepts are social constructions because they have meanings which are socially recognized, socially exchanged and shared. We can see that only in civilization, and particular to a given society, can it become possible to talk of things being right or wrong, as we've said before. Our primitive man was, of course, neither virtuous nor evil because he had no understanding of the concepts of virtue and evil. These are concepts that have been formed around words, and these words have exchanged meanings through the medium, of course, of language exchange. They're spoken, they're written. So before the concept of evil, evil couldn't have existed. This is what Rousseau's saying. Well, it does seem to be, he does seem to be saying precisely that. Before we had a concept of morality, there was no morality. It was impossible to be moral nor immoral, as I've said to you. So through this, our language educates us. We're given concepts which then become the basis of our understandings. And these concepts are exchanged between us. And through these concepts, of course, we establish the rules of society which go on to become the basis of our morality. Well, again, to go back to that point he had about morality, it's an artificial creation, as all society is. And of course, through a distorted society, we will get distorted morality also. So, in particular, various doctrines, such as John Locke's, which justifies to us in language human inequality and all the problems that come with it. So, the argument runs, property creates inequality and language is used to disguise it. And here, I think we can see how that might influence Marx later on, in the sense that the basis of the misery is a material one. The unequal property ownership is really the basis of the problem. But ideologically speaking, language is then used to kind of disguise the immorality of it and convince us that it is in fact a moral condition. Now let's turn to PowerPoint number 8, please. So here we are then. Man in society has lost his natural virtues and acquired social vices. So what's the solution to this? Well, if the discourse on inequality states the problem, then the solution in many ways he comes up with in the social contract. And I have to say that after the discourse of inequality, I think the social contract is certainly a logical continuation of his ideas, but some of his political conclusions are something of a disappointment, I think. But to go on from what he was saying in the discourse, we can't go back to the original state of nature that he described to us. And he said we shouldn't make the attempt to do it. It's just impossible, and we shouldn't try. And it would be disastrous if we did. In developed societies, primitive man was gone. He was destroyed long ago, and he's gone forever. It may be a crying shame, but there's nothing we can do about it now. We've moved on. We've changed human nature irreparably in that regard. We can't go back to what we were before. We can't unlearn in this regard and relearn those things and sort of wind history back in this way. And more practically, we simply can't reacquire all the knowledge and skills that our man in the state of nature had. We would not survive too long. We've basically forgotten these things. We've grown too fond of comforts and technological aids and so forth, even in Rousseau's time. Beds to sleep in, for example. We've become too fond of these things. And in other words, we've become too dependent on society. But at a point in history, then we entered into a thing called society. We thought that this would be to our advantage, but Rousseau thinks that this has turned out badly for us. But he still thinks that we carry something of the primitive man. He retains, today's socialized man retains a capacity for empathy. That's something which Rousseau thinks is innate. And if it's innate, it's not something that can be socially conditioned out of us. So the empathy's still there. Even though the use of the human imagination, which Hume would describe, would prevent us through ideological distortion from acting upon our empathetic instincts. But still, each man's power and freedom are his main means of survival. It's just that his environment has changed. He now lives in a man-made condition. But entering into society raises a fundamental political question that he poses in the social contract. How is man to put his freedoms under the control of others without damaging himself? This is the original question for Rousseau, not forgetting his idea that, of course, in a state of nature, man lived an independent existence, solitary, independent existence. So we seem to give up freedoms, don't we, and put them under the control of society. But the answer would be, if we can't go back to living in a natural condition anymore, and he thinks that this is impossible. So the fundamental political problem then is how to put man under the control of others without damaging that person's interests and freedoms. And Rousseau puts it in the following way, and I quote, "How is a method of association to be found which will defend and protect, using the power of all, the person and property of each member, and still enable each member of the group to obey only himself and to remain as free as before?" Well, that must be the $44,000 question, mustn't it, of political theory. How is a method of association to be found which will defend and protect, using the power of all, the person and property of each member, and still enable each member of the group to obey only himself and to remain as free as before? So Rousseau wants it both ways, doesn't he? He wants you to enter into society, but he wants you to remain seemingly as free as you were before. It seems a bit paradoxical. But remember, there's no going back in time. But neither can we stay as we are, because we're deeply unhappy creatures, and we are headed perhaps for some further catastrophe in the future if we go on in this way. So he's already ruled out this idea that we can unravel the process of history and sort of unlearn history and go backwards and start again. We can't. This is impossible. So the only way to go is forward. And Rousseau I think it's important to understand that he criticizes the modern age not because he's against progress. He's not. He's not some sort of a rejectionist who argues that going back to living some sort according to some sort of pre-technological and very simplistic lifestyle. He's not advocating that, a return to the earth, as it were. He's not actually against progress as such. This is an easy mistake to make with Rousseau. No, he criticizes modern civilization because it's socialized men badly. This is the point about modern civilization. It's socialized men badly, but that's not necessarily a technological or property question. This is more a question of the morality that humans have adopted for themselves in their societies. So the basis of our acceptance of the terms for our living together has become corrupted. It's wrong. We've come to place the wrong value on things, and we've become we've come to place the wrong value on each other, and we've come to judge each other accordingly, and so forth, with all the misery that that brings, and all the amour propre and status and egoism and vanity that comes with it. But Rousseau does see, of course, that history is a moving process. And this would affect later rationalist thinkers in the European tradition. And because history is a moving process, it's a developmental process. It's just that it's developing badly. So, but it's still offering possibilities because it's in movement. And if it's in movement, therefore, humans must be malleable and adaptable because they've been adapted out of their natural conditions into these artificial conditions. And so they are indeed malleable and adaptable. And when we come to talking about human nature, there isn't a human nature as such. So if they've been corrupted by society, they can be uncorrupted, can't they? They can remake their society in order to make themselves better into the future. In other words, arrest the current development, stop the current development and start again. That's not start again in prehistory. That's to start again here, now. And again, we can see this idea crop up in socialist thinking and in Marxist thinking. This idea, of course, that communist society would begin history again. So Rousseau is saying then that men can arrest and reverse their moral decline. But to do that, we must submit to a different kind of socialization, a different kind of social contract. Now, the revolution that Rousseau proposes involves a fresh look at what it means to be free. A fresh look at what it means to be free. The liberal democratic societies that common in the West now, with its doctrine of rule by the majority, is not the answer to the question of freedom. The will of the majority in these situations is always imposed on everyone, and therefore some will be suppressed by it. This is the problem. So Rousseau believed in direct democracy, as we see. But there's more to democracy than simply expressing the majoritarian view. There's more to democracy than that. We can't call ourselves free in a democracy where, as a minority, we're oppressed by the majority. That's something that a liberal would certainly agree with right away, somebody like Locke. But what is needed is for everyone to agree on the social conditions and laws, which of course something that Locke would completely eschew. Common agreement is the only means to escape the tyranny of the domination of others. And so democracy, as it's used and employed today, doesn't really produce that kind of agreement. It's just majoritarian rule. And if you take a country like Britain with its first past the post electoral system, then actually you can get a situation where you've got a government that's with a huge majority dictating to the majority of the country. The majority of the British electorate in the last election voted for other parties and not the governing party that it's got. And Rousseau made this point about the British, that they vote every 5 years and think themselves free. Now, to achieve proper freedom for society, and therefore for all men, we must blend our particular will with the will of the whole of society. And this the will of the whole of society, Rousseau calls the general will. And this is a very difficult concept to get your head around. The particular will is driven by what we call today the ego or self-interest. This is this liberal concept, the self-interest, the self-awareness, the self-centeredness of the expression of the will. But Rousseau says that we ought to combine our particular will in this way with the will of everyone else. And only in doing this will we enter into society with other men and remain as free as we were before. So the general will is the answer to the question he posed about how we are to enter into society and yet remain as individuals as free as we were before. That is to pool our particularism with the general will. And what Rousseau's calling upon us to do here is to break out of our narrow egoism, to break out of our the restrictions that we put on ourselves as individuals, and to go beyond ourselves, to take ourselves out of our own individualistic restriction, and to combine then and to see as our interests caught up in the interests of everybody else. So our self-interest then has got to be conquered in order to make the general will work. the narrow self-interest. We've got to go beyond it and pool our interest with the interests of everybody else. As Rousseau said right at the beginning, if one person in society is not free, then the whole of society is not free. His general will then is very much concerned with this project of having everybody free and no one tyrannized, but having everybody being a part of the process in which you subject yourself to government. So everybody is at once the government, and everybody is at once the subject of government. So what Rousseau is trying to do then is to bring everyone's interest into harmony with our own, and to harmonize our interests with everybody else, on the basis of an understanding that our freedom is also involved in their freedom, and their freedom is also involved in ours. And once we've reached that stage, we've reached properly socialized man. So the problem for society then is that it is a society and it is dependent, but it doesn't function on the basis of conceiving itself as a society with a society interest in itself. And when we therefore harmonize ourselves with the interests of society, we've conquered our own individualism and our own narrow individualism, and much of the basis of the problems that we face in society today. Now, let's turn to PowerPoint number 9. Rousseau thinks that only by going beyond self-interest can we solve our problems. And he says in the social contract, and it opens with the famous words, "Man was born free, and everywhere he is in chains." Now, everywhere the rights and freedoms of people are trampled over by governments with no legitimate basis to govern. A government has no right, thinks Rousseau, to take away people's freedoms. If this has occurred, the people are justified, he says, in taking it back. So he's a revolutionary, isn't he? To prevent this theft of people's freedoms, Rousseau argues that we're all required to become active in governing. So whether you like politics or not, sorry buddy, but you're going to have to get involved in politics, because otherwise you'll be subject to somebody else's rule. And that is tantamount to enslavement. You've got to get involved. This is the condition of what Rousseau imagines is citizenship. And in Rousseau's usage, the term citizenship is directly opposite to the people being subjects or subject to government. The people, for Rousseau, has to be sovereign. The people is sovereign. And I don't say the people are sovereign, because that means that the people are fragmented as individuals. He says the people is sovereign. It's single. It's singular. The people is. So the people is all one thing. And you've achieved that oneness by the method of the general will, by coming to the formation of the general will. So the ultimate authority is the people, and the people, says Rousseau, must not export their sovereignty to anyone or anything outside of themselves. They must retain. They can have governments, but they must retain sovereignty for themselves. The government has to be put at the service of the people, and this idea crops up in Immanuel Kant. So if they do relinquish their sovereignty and pass their sovereignty over to the control of someone or something else, they will place themselves back in the chains of slavery that Rousseau is keen to liberate them from. Now, when Rousseau talks to the people, then Rousseau means the whole thing as a sort of organic entity with an individual identity of its own. So crucial to his political thinking then is this idea that the only way that you can make this community work, and for people to enjoy freedoms, original freedoms, before they entered into the social contract, the freedoms they have as individuals, is to go beyond this narrow self-interest and discover our social being, to discover our social selves, our social natures. And unless we can do this, we're simply putting ourselves into an individualistic prison. So our individualistic freedoms in this way have to become socialized freedoms. And socialized freedoms doesn't mean anything unless everyone is made free by them. So, Rousseau can't envisage a society in which someone is the slave or servant of another in this regard, because that would corrupt the whole of society, and then the whole of society becomes unfree as a result of it. So the idea of the social contract then is therefore to give back men their freedom and their independence. And this is in a different form from the one that they enjoyed when they were primitive, of course, but it's one that tries to capitalize on certain natural virtues that have been socialized out of human beings, such as our capacity for the expression of our capacity for empathy, and of course our amour de soi, our more natural feelings that we have, our natural feelings of self-esteem and self-respect, rather than those that are conferred on us and dictated to us by the distorted society in which we live. Now, this is a much better way to govern, but it's still essentially artificial, and Rousseau knows that. Any natural freedom men might think they have here is to be given up on entering society, but men thus place themselves in a condition of obedience to the laws of that society, but this can only be done on the basis of their consent, which is why the idea, of course, of the social contract is maintained from Hobbes and Locke's idea of social contract. But for Rousseau, the bargain is a very good one. That is, we don't lose if we govern ourselves with the general will of the community, because we are a part of the community ourselves. When we put ourselves and make ourselves truly a part of the community can never oppress it, because we would essentially be oppressing ourselves, and that's a logical impossibility. So in practical political terms, if we make our own laws and we are a part of the construction of of the laws that we have made for ourselves, then we can't be suppressed by them. Only in this way can we avoid becoming subject to tyranny and corrupt government. So the general will then is Rousseau's answer to the puzzle of how to enter society and remain as free as we were before. If we submit to society, we should only do so by consenting to abide by the general will of society itself, of which we, as individuals, all of us, are a part. If all citizens agree to abide by the general will, all citizens will be free and all citizens will also be equal. This is because all will have given up the claim to freedom that forms the particular will. But that is what is abandoned when we enter into Rousseau's social contract. The particular will. We can't have that particular. We can't exercise freedom outside of a social condition. This is Rousseau's conclusion here, because this can lead to all kinds of problems in society. So the general will then will promote the common good of society, and this is because everyone agrees only to associate on the basis of what is good for everyone else. Thus everyone is free of the dominance and inequalities and the chaos of atomistic particular wills. The general will, if it acts to construct laws and forms the basis of government, can never be wrong or unjust, because at its heart is the interest of the whole of society. And the whole of society, of course, is a part of drawing up that what that general will actually is. It's a social expression. And this general will, of course, in Rousseau's political theory, is to be discovered and employed through the use of direct democracy. Direct democracy, the sort of democracy that was practiced in ancient Athens, where the whole of the community gathers. So we don't have a group of legislators who are different from the law, from the rest of society. The whole of society becomes the law-making legislative body itself. And like all democracies, direct democracies, debates can go on until a satisfactory decision is found for all members of society. So this will involve compromises and trade-offs, and we will become truly socially engaged through this process of trying to discover the general will. It will truly socially engage us because we will have to see things from other people's point of views, and that will, of course, stimulate our innate empathetic capacity that he's already said that we have, and it will develop it and expand upon it. And make this capacity for empathy really more of a distinct feature of human calculation. So Rousseau's not expecting any of us to obey the law of any aspect of this democratic process. The democratic process itself has to discover the general will. And to do that, to discover the general will, compromises will have to go on and on and on. That's not to say that everybody in the construction of that general will come out having exactly what they want from the process. So we haven't got sort of winners and losers. What Rousseau imagines here is that there will be a trade-off, and we will have to stay there and argue for this trade-off until everybody comes out with some satisfaction and everybody thinks, well, look, there's been sufficient compromise for this thing to work. Now we've all agreed that this is what we will do. And this is really what he means by the general will. The general will is a little bit of a mystical concept in Rousseau, and probably more papers and essays have been written about the general will than any other aspect of Rousseau's thought. But it's so central to his political thinking, and this idea of re-socializing men on the right terms, and that is to recognize that we are more than just individuals, that society's got its own interest, and therefore as a society we've got a kind of a duty to discover what's required in order to do what is best for society, and that is the identification of the general will. So Rousseau, he didn't, oddly enough, having said everything he did about property being the origin of the problem in the discourse on inequality, Rousseau didn't seek to outlaw property, and he thought, well, we've got to this stage now where property is so it has become so fundamental to us that really, even if we try to outlaw property, this will probably have a socially damaging effect. Instead, he thinks that if we put ourselves under the general will, then we'll never be in a position where we can use our property to seek advantages over others. So we can have our property, but the only way we can have it responsibly, socially responsibly, and use it socially responsibly would be to subject it to the check, as it were, imposed upon it by the general will. And so for the general will to operate meaningfully, we would never subject property outside of the context of the general will and use it to damage a society and to damage social harmony. But if rather controversially here, and I'll just leave you on this particular point, if individualistic selfishness remains in certain people in society, Rousseau has led to a rather, for liberals at least, a rather alarming conclusion. He says that such individuals who retain selfishness and simply cannot bring themselves to be a part of the general will and contribute towards it, those persons must be forced to be free. So if selfishness remains in certain individuals, if certain individuals cannot be socialized, then Rousseau says those individuals must be forced to be free. And for liberals, there is no other more quoted line from Rousseau than this idea that if there is a majority of people who simply just cannot see past their own egos and to harmonize their own ego with the overall social general will and general well-being, then those individuals will have to be forced to be free. And in some ways, Rousseau here has found the maxim that would have been employed in the real existing communist states of the 20th century, that where certain people wanted to retain their individuality. The fallback for the state would be to consider that the well-being of the state trumps anybody else's individuality, and therefore it's the well-being of the state that comes first. And so individuality in that sense was suppressed. I'm not sure if that's really, we could talk about the USSR in the 20th century as being conforming to Rousseau's idea, because Rousseau would have said, don't give your sovereignty away to anyone. And perhaps what the Russian people did was they gave it away to a very minority elite kind of party apparatchik, which was not really what Rousseau was talking about. But nevertheless, I think there's a lot that we can discuss in Rousseau. Some even see him as a sort of a fundamental architect of fascism in the 20th century. I'm not altogether convinced of that myself, but one can see in this idea of the general will a kind of collectivized potential that maybe could become dangerous. Apart from that, though, I think that what Rousseau's given us is something highly original. After I read Rousseau and started thinking about his ideas, he is one of those thinkers that I really very much appreciate. And he's one of the favourites that I have to teach, and so I've enjoyed this session today. And I will talk, of course, in our seminar in a couple of days. So thanks for your attention, and I'll see you soon.